Cancer therapy seemed to be a place where time and time again you were seeing patients being wheeled into the hospital, like on the stretcher, because something had gone seriously wrong, and it'd gone wrong in their home. Imagine getting on a plane and you had a pilot who took off looking at all the controls and then just covered everything up, laid back, fell asleep and just waited for the stall alarm to go off or the low altitude alarm to go off. And then you're doing something about it. That reactive approach that was being taken, by no fault of the clinicians, it just didn't feel good enough. And it felt like there was a huge opportunity there to actually address something. Is there an opportunity to take today's technology to really start sort of solving some of these problems?
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Healthtech Podcast. With me this week, I have Toby Basey-Fisher, and he's the CEO of Entia. Entia is unlocking the full potential of cancer therapy by predicting and preventing side effects. They have a blood-based remote patient monitoring device with predictive analytics, and we are going to hear all about it today. But first, Toby, welcome to the Healthtech Podcast. How are you doing, sir?
Thank you, James. Really great to be here. Doing very well. I think off the back of a month's worth of travel to 3 different continents, but very successful.
Wow, where have you been? What have you been
doing? Kicked off with ASCO over in Chicago. Very exciting, interesting week. A lot of new therapies coming to market at the moment, obviously with a lot of side effects as well. So there was a lot to sort of dig into there with some of the big pharma and value-based care providers. And then it was over to Germany for another conference talking about the future of AI and possible AI washing that is going on everywhere within the industry. And thankfully then out to North Africa for a bit of a break.
Very nice. Where in North Africa?
So sort of Morocco area.
Ideal. Beautiful, man. Do you surf? Is that what you're doing out there? Can you surf?
I wish. Surfing is that one thing alternative life I wish I'd got into. Skateboarding, snowboarding, all fine. Never got to have a chance of surfing.
Glorious. Good stuff, man. Well, listen, the way we start this podcast is for you to tell your story. Now, obviously, to get to a point where you're founding, an at-home device company that's doing everything that you're doing, spending time on 3 different continents, etc. I'm interested in how one gets there. So, why don't you start at the beginning, mate, and tell us your story.
I often feel for so many founders, it comes back to just this obsession of problem solving. And I think for me, it was just no different. And I was thinking last night about this, that what has really driven me in this direction. And so I think about my earliest memories to see if there was anything that I saw as a real meaningful point in my life. And there was a wonderful memory that came back to me, which was around the crisp packets. And we used to have let's say 8-foot tall built-in fridge, and there was a gap down the back of it. And we used to keep all of our multi-pack crisps on the top of it. And slowly over the course of a couple of months, as a 6-7-year-old, I was watching these crisps fall down the back of the fridge and getting more and more upset that my daily snack was just disappearing and not being made available to me. And my parents, bless them, were really nice. They got up and was trying to fish them out. And I think at that moment, I suggested to them just to go get a vacuum cleaner, put it onto low suction and drop the Hoover tube down the back of it and then fish them back up. And it worked.
Brilliant.
And that was one of those really I genuinely felt really proud as a result of that. So I do wonder if that's really got me hooked on this the satisfaction of solving a problem, and particularly having seen my parents not being able to do it and then being able to find a way around it. So I'm obsessed with solving problems. It's so satisfying, and through my whole career, it's evolved from something very technically orientated with problem solving, and nowadays it's more about seeing how I can solve other people's problems with our products, trying to convince them to buy into the journey that we're on and what we're trying to do in cancer care. But I think school for me wasn't where my passion for this space came about at all. I was pretty lost by the time I finished my A-levels. I really was fed up of learning for the sake of learning, for doing exams. And I think it was my dad's suggestion to go and read physics as an undergraduate. Simply because we felt it was a flexible enough degree that you could probably go and do a whole raft of different things off the back of it. When I did get to uni 6 months in, I fell in love with the subject. It was for the first time I could start seeing we were being armed with like skills and sort of knowledge that you could then start seeing how you could put it to use. Like you had like laboratory sessions already within the first year where you had open-ended questions so that it was up to you to go and find things out and discover stuff. And I remember sort of like characterizing the scales of butterflies to understand why they're so blue, and just like these amazing things you get to turn your hand to. And that's combined, I think, with an amazing tutor that I had, Matt Lockyer, the most unconventional man I'd ever met at that point. He was sort of ex-lorry driver, worked in the slaughterhouse, and decided, like sort of, I think in his late 20s, early 30s, that he should probably go back to school and do something a bit different. And went to sort of, completed his A-levels, got his degree in physics, got a PhD, became a lecturer, and became my tutor. And he was just a huge inspiration of just like sort of, driving yourself hard so that, finding good problems to solve. So by the time I finished my degree, I just, couldn't get enough of physics. I knew I had to go and do more of it. And PhD just seemed like a great way to go and sort of really put the skills that you've acquired to use. And I'd sort of developed a sort of pretty decent understanding of electromagnetics. And there was an amazing research team headed up by Sir John Pendry at Imperial College. He's pretty renowned for his work on like cloaking devices, so bending light around objects, recombining it as if there was nothing there, and sort of he'd proved a lot of the theoretical work. And sort of just as I was completing my degree, they managed to prove this experimentally as well in the microwave spectrum. So I was pretty keen to go work with his group. So they accepted me. I sort of kicked off my PhD with him, Stefan Meyer, and Norbert Klein, and within I think 2-3 weeks of starting that PhD. They've got me setting up some equipment to characterize liquids and things in liquids. And that was it. It destroyed all of my plans. I went in a totally different direction. 2 years later, I was getting a PhD in biomedical physics, having never studied like biology since I was 16. So it was like a real serendipity, just like being given the chance to go and sort of develop some technology that introduced me to a whole new field. And it was real blue sky research at that point. I was literally just trying to understand how do liquids respond to microwave radiation? So if I add some proteins into that, how do they respond? And it led to some really interesting publications. That work then went on to actually demonstrate that you can characterize the interaction of proteins using the bound water around the surface of the protein in liquids. So it was sort of some pretty cool, like blue sky out there sort of research. But it really sort of got me interested again within sort of the technical applications of characterizing sort of things like blood, because naturally my interest went from, well, let's characterize water, let's do some alcohols, let's sort of add some salts, let's add some proteins. Oh, what about cells? And before I found myself like pricking my finger, putting some blood on this like sort of device to sort of see how it characterized the sort of nature of sort of cells. And two things happened towards the end of my PhD that finally brought me into the world of oncology. And one of those was actually having a family member diagnosed with cancer very close to me and seeing firsthand just how brutal the journey was for them, and seeing sort of the suffering that they went through, the challenges, the hardships of it. And at the same time, because I was sort of just doing this research around characterizing blood, I started hanging out quite a lot at Hammersmith Hospital here in London. And day after day, I was sort of around the oncologists and the hematologists and seeing waiting rooms filled with patients. And just my natural curiosity got the better of me. And I just found myself just chatting day after day to a lot of these staff members and seeing that sort of what my family member was going through was no different to what thousands of others, tens, hundreds of thousands globally sort of go through every single year. And that, I think, really opened my eyes to sort of like a major problem. What we had was like a healthcare system which had fairly limited capacity, being stretched by a growing number of patients on longer treatments, still with lots of toxicities and difficulties around them. And on a personal level, there being no end of challenges in terms of sort of having this unpredictable, quite scary journey that people embarked on as they went through cancer treatment. And that sort of then piqued my curiosity over sort of like where were the biggest problems in this system. And cancer therapy seemed to be a place where time and time again you were seeing patients being wheeled into the hospital like on the stretcher because something had gone seriously wrong, and it'd gone wrong in their home. And as I spoke to sort of some of the clinical team, what they sort of started citing were things like febrile neutropenia severe dehydration caused by vomiting, nausea, diarrhea. You had sort of like severe anemia, which was just wiping people out. They had no ability to get oxygen around their body. So there was the same side effects just kept coming up time and time again. And when you looked at what was really happening, the patients were being managed within the community most of the time. And when I say managed, they weren't really being managed. What was happening, the treatment was given in the hospital, or maybe they were given pills to take it home. And then there was no oversight. There was no ability to really see what was happening to these patients. And at the time, I remember the analogy that really resonated with me was imagine getting on a plane and you had a pilot who took off looking at all the controls and then just covered everything up, laid back, fell asleep, and just waited for the stall alarm to go off or the low altitude alarm to go off. And then you're doing something about it. And that reactive approach that was being taken, by no fault of the clinicians or sort of the clinical community, it just didn't feel good enough. And it felt like there was a huge opportunity there to actually address something. So that was I think, really the starting point of thinking about, well, should there be a company here? Is there an opportunity to take today's technology to really start solving some of these problems? So it was a fairly winding route with no real design or intentions earlier in my career or life to actually end up within the medical space. But I am so glad that I ended up here, because the sheer volume of problems are immense. I mean, I keep a diary now of just all the things I come across that at some day in the future, I hope to be able to come back to and actually address, because the human body is complex. You've got this constant balance between costs and quality of care, a lot of interesting ethical and moral considerations and balances. And it just makes for a fascinating area to work in. I mean, it's just really invigorating. And that the changes that you're introducing, the solutions that are being brought to market, they're having such tangible impacts on people's lives. I mean, when we I guess we'll talk about Entia a little bit more in a bit, but it's I had a really stark reminder of just how meaningful I think some of the changes that we can make within cancer care are. I mean, I had my former supervisor, Norbert Klein, who was one of my PhD supervisors. I mean, he passed away last year, unfortunately, from cancer. And there was just an incredible moment where I was on the phone to him, and he was speaking to me from A&E because of the side effects that he'd experienced from cancer therapy. And he was having to sign shareholder papers to get stuff all sorted for one of our last investment rounds. And I suddenly realized that he shouldn't be there. No. We should, we've got the opportunity over the next few years to make sure that people in his situation don't end up sat in the bed with severe complications. And to see the fact that this can have really meaningful impact on those people that are closest to me, and frankly, half of us. I mean, probably between you and I, one of us is going to have cancer in our lifetime. Yeah. And I sure as hell hope that there's new innovations that allow for a better understanding of my health as I'm going through treatment to actually prevent these serious complications.
It's an incredible story, man. And it's nice just how that story it's so personal, isn't it? And I find this a lot with Healthtech founders, we need to get our resilience from somewhere in Healthtech. There are so many issues with growing companies in this space. There are so many hurdles. There are so many barriers and problems with how to sell. And there's problems galore. And you've talked a lot about problems. And I do find that a personal story like the one you've just described can help so much with resilience. And just knowing that you're on this path for such a specific reason, it's a beautiful thing. And we're all trying to create businesses. We're trying to create value. We're trying to bring something to the world. But call me biased, but it's not the same in fintech, is it? It's not the same in insurtech, is it? There's something different and there's something special. One thing that I want to just take you back to when you talked about that introduction of biology into your working life at that point. There's something for me about, and actually this kind of relates to the crisps behind the fridge as well. There's something for me about your journey that sounds like the way that artists often describe innovation versus the way that scientists describe innovation. Scientists describe innovation very clearly about finding a problem, doing experiments to find the solution, and it's very sort of logical. Whereas artists will talk about play. They'll talk about broadly just procrastinating their way into something, or playing their way into something that sort of eventually works. And it's funny because like the way that you describe that initial, like just seeing how, liquid molecules behave to micro, it seemed like there was no purpose behind that. I mean, there was, but there wasn't. It's the most I've heard sort of a play version of scientific PhD experiments. I've not heard it in such a kind of a broad way, I guess. And there's something about your whole journey that reflects that for me. Like you talk about problem solving a lot, but sticking a Hoover down and fishing out your crisps with a Hoover, like there's a lot of play involved in that as well. There's a lot of sort of, I guess, rather than thinking very academically about that, it was a sort of a playful version of it. I guess it's more of a reflection than a question, but I don't know if that sort of more artistic and playful version of innovation is something that relates to you.
Massively so. The two go hand in hand for me anyway. Like I've often found myself straddling both worlds. Interestingly, back at school, the subjects that I studied was sort of like maths, sort of chemistry, physics, and art.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So interesting.
So
okay.
I occasionally, if I get the time, so there will.
And I didn't know that before. I'm just going to call that. I didn't actually know that.
No, so and I see a huge amount of beauty within science and within problem solving. I mean, I think it is very creative as a process. I mean, so that I'm a huge believer in sort of like the scientific method and sort of actually like when you're addressing a problem, like going back to sort of I guess your sort of fundamental like sort of first principle approach, like thinking like a scientist, like sort of I'm all for that. But then when you sort of like get to sort of your problem solving mode, sort of get divergent, get creative. Like my son's just got to an age where we sort of we're working with Lego a lot at home, and we don't do Lego kits. I mean, we do the first time we get them, but afterwards it all gets broken up. It all goes back into a giant box. And then we create problems for ourselves. I mean, we built a suspension bridge between two cupboards the other day because why not? And I think it's nice just to give him the tools and sort of like the inspiration to go and think about how we could solve this and just maybe say, well, look, how do we get from A to B? What's the simplest way of doing that? And just getting creative about that. And yeah, again, so the Entia have had the pleasure of actually being able to do a lot of that creative thinking and working very, very closely with healthcare professionals and patients as we develop our products to sort of, really understand what their needs are, but then actually sort of get creative on our side about, well, what could the possible solutions actually be?
I do wonder if that's something that we can learn quite broadly in even tech or entrepreneurship or whatever you want to call it, that play is okay. You can play your way to a solution. And as you say, like that part about once you've decided what problem, you've done some first principle thinking, you've done some scientific method, actually the experimentation to actually, discover what a potential solution might be. I think I do honestly believe that there's a lot can be learned. I think we all take ourselves too seriously sometimes, and academia really struggles with this. I think, there's people, Bell in our team particularly just gets so frustrated at the way that the academia communicates itself to the world through academic journals, and it's sort of we put literally the most innovative things, the most cutting edge, the most brand new discoveries in the entire world through such a dull framework that like it's just unbelievable, like how much we're sort of like cutting ourselves off at the knees there. It's in that world. It's funny.
It's challenging, and it's sort of I didn't realize it at the time. But I guess having the privilege of being able to do a PhD, so that taught me how to sort of assess lots of journals quite quickly and sort of work out what a paper actually means and what's being said in it. But there's a skill we often have to teach to people here about sort of how do you make sense of these really quite inaccessible, often sort of pieces of work that are written really flamboyantly, to show off who knows more words than another scientist, or sort of more complex mathematics in their paper.
Yeah. I don't know how much I can pass this off as health tech on the Healthtech podcast, but very briefly, if you can, a cloaking device is that possible? Are we going to see an invisibility cloak appear anytime soon?
Yeah, so the whole sort of foundation of sort of this was around metamaterials, so sort of like negative refractive index sort of material. So using sort of like sub-wavelength properties. So I don't know, let's say you've got a microwave that has perhaps like a 10 centimeter wavelength, or what you can do is you can like sort of create sub-wavelength features on a piece of material, so like capacitors or inductors, and to the wave or the photon, I guess, as it comes in, it maybe like reflects off the material, gets absorbed by it. It doesn't see the individual features. It just sees a average or a blurring of the whole characteristics of the material. And so basically they were able to create some really incredible properties using these sort of features, so things like sub-diffraction limit lenses, to sort of like see smaller things than ever been seen before at a certain wavelength. And cloaking devices were one of the things that I think they realized they could use, was actually sort of just bending light around an object, recombining it as if nothing was there. So it's not the biggest challenge is limited on the frequencies it can work at. So you might get it to work on like red light, but then you'll see it in blue light. So broad spectrum cloaking devices, I mean, who knows, maybe sort of DARPA, BAE have got their sort of hands on this tech now and sort of have been quietly pursuing broad spectrum cloaking devices. But certainly when I was involved with it, it was still fairly limited.
I think from a national security perspective, anyone that is starting to crack that is probably going to keep it very close to their chest, aren't they? To give whoever it is a heck of an advantage. Cool. I'll talk about some actual health tech now, and relieve you from cloaking devices. But Entia, this is interesting, man. And there's been people close to me that have had cancer and have passed away from cancer, and I know this problem well. Even friends of the family. That when they get to a certain stage, you're absolutely right. There is this model in healthcare, this sort of hospital-centric model. We go to a place to get the tests, to get the treatment. We go there for the healthcare. We get the healthcare done there, and then we come home. And you're right, that analogy you used about, you can see all the controls, you can get instantaneous feedback. If something goes wrong, you can correct it because you sat in the cockpit. All of a sudden, it's almost like it's not even putting the veil over all the controls. It's literally just like leaving the cockpit and just locking the door and actually going to the back of the plane and just sitting there. And then just putting treacle in between you and the plane, so that it's actually really difficult to now access that stuff again. Now, like, you've got to wade through all of that to get there if something does go wrong. It's sort of like that in the way that you've described it, and my perception of it. And I guess my question here is, where are we now? And I know I'm aware there's a postcode lottery, and even in my mind, I'm like, well, was that just the healthcare that the people that I've seen have had, or is this actually how cancer care is delivered at that stage for people? Is it the fact that nobody has your device at home? Is it the case that some do? Is it the case that it is being bought by some areas? And I guess can you just plot the lie of the land for me in terms of what is the situation now? And I guess then where does your device fit in? Mm-hmm. And we'll then go on to talk about how we might get there in the future. Yeah.
So, I mean, cancer care is fairly standardized, certainly across like Europe, North America. You get some fairly sort of similar approaches to how chemotherapy in particular, or sort of targeted therapies, immunotherapies are delivered. And often that is a patient interaction in the hospital where there'll be an assessment done, check that you're healthy enough to receive your treatment. The treatment will be given if it's an intravenous, so like a bag full of fluid being given to you. Otherwise, back out to the home with some pills to sort of take over maybe like 21 days, take a break for 7 days, come back in again for your next sort of cycle of sort of treatments to have. And broadly speaking, there is still, like we sort of discussed earlier, I mean, just this gap where there is just no insight and no information. And I think right at the beginning when we started the company, we'd speak to clinical teams and we still get it actually even now sometimes, is that I think there's this belief that sort of, we've got an acute hotline, people can call up if they're feeling unwell. And those hotlines do get used, but again, they're always reactive. It's always like something has gone wrong and then you're doing something about it. And even with the wealth of sort of digital health sort of noise that has been, these great creations, I think we're still not seeing broad uptake of a lot of digital solutions within centres, and partly due to a capacity issue and sort of lack of innovation funding. But it's slowly changing. We are sort of being able to sort of shed some light now on patients' health as they progress through treatment and get those earlier interventions underway. But I think there is a huge way to go. Massive opportunity. I mean, there is some great data that sort of got published a few years back now, actually, from a US clinical team that sort of just took symptoms tracking. Just let's put sort of an app in patients' homes, let's take some symptoms and let's sort of just intervene earlier. And it was remarkable. I mean, sort of it was nearly a 10% survival increase in the patient cohort just exactly. Yes. And we talk about drugs that get funded to the tune of hundreds of thousands of pounds for sort of making such claims. And here was sort of, an innovation, which is as simple as like a app that's sort of, I think it took sort of end of life survival. I believe it was sort of around 7 months to up to 8 months or something for that. And that's a real tangible increase for a digital solution. That's really quite meaningful. And even though we've got all of that data, and I think so, there's some great stuff from Resilience or from Gustave Rossi out in Paris, the Capri study. And again, they showed huge reductions in complications, better patient quality of life, fewer like sort of emergency room or A&E utilizations. And we've got a growing body of evidence, which is really positive. But we now just need to sort of get through the very difficult process of procurement, adoption, sort of, really spreading the news, getting it out there.
Cool. Can you now explain to me what the device is and where it fits in to this, I guess, newer vision of the clinical pathway and what that clinical pathway looks like with your device in it?
Mm-hmm. So going back to what the clinicians were telling us when we sort of got the company underway, what we were hearing time and again was this list of complications. And some of them would be identifiable through symptoms and just a patient being able to say, I've got this particular thing happening to me, or I've got this rash on my skin, so should we do something about it? But some of them were only possible to understand if you actually had a blood test. And that's where sort of like the starting point of Entia really came from, was actually realizing that there was no possible way other than bringing a patient into the clinical community or sending very expensive nurses or phlebotomists into patients' homes to get a blood draw to actually see day by day what was really happening to these individuals. And I mean, we've seen the power of what's happened with glucose monitoring and with diabetics. So that there was a little bit of work around sort of anticoagulation monitoring when people went onto warfarin after strokes. But there's been nothing within the oncology space at all. So we really felt there was a huge gap there to address and sort of to build a technology platform that really allowed us to sort of peer inside patients' health using blood tests in their own home, taking something as simple as a finger prick, a drop of blood, being able to actually then measure it within the patient's home to be able to actually flag that something is going wrong. So when we looked at the list of all the complications, we looked at the thorough analysis of like where all the costs were being incurred, what was happening most often. Things like febrile neutropenia were really high up, anemia, thrombocytopenia, the things related to blood counts. Obviously, liver function, kidney function is very often affected through these treatments, but blood counts just seem to be so impactful. And so that was our starting point of setting ourselves the ridiculous sort of goal of like, could we build the world's first at-home full blood count analyzer? And it was audacious. I think no one had done it before. I think Philips were tens of millions of euros into sort of trying to develop something, but they ultimately threw the towel in. And here was little old Entia as a small spin out, first time startup founder, trying to build a team to build this thing. And well, fast forward quite a few years, we've actually pulled it off. So the cornerstone of our innovation now is the world's first at-home full blood count analyzer. We got approval towards the end of last year. We're now in the midst of rolling out across the NHS in partnership with groups like Pfizer. And that's I think been a huge shift in what's possible. And there are multiple applications for this. There's a couple of key areas where we can see the opportunity to really reshape the way that cancer patients are being managed.
So I'm curious, and this might sound like a really stupid question, but I do find the stupid questions are often the ones everyone's thinking anyway. You're right, first time founder, university spin out, taking on Philips and anyone else, any other big company trying to do this. How, like practically speaking, how did you go about making this device? And my sub question here is like, at home, in inverted commas, I think is adding something here to either complexity or an issue with like it goes from being venous to capillary, maybe in terms of blood, like so, and maybe it's about accuracy, but how does a first time founder go about creating a medical device, having never created a medical device before, and what does the at home component add to this whole equation?
Mm-hmm. So the at-home piece to start with, I mean, yeah, absolutely adds complexity. There are so many things that a sort of previous sort of user of our product has never encountered before. Like a lot of the patients that we work with have never pricked their finger ever before, unless they've had diabetes and they've used a glucometer. So yeah, there's all the sort of usability factors that go into it. There's sort of the fact that, yeah, you're not going to be sending service personnel to the home either. Sort of, yeah, do you really want patients fiddling around with quality control? So there's so many considerations that have to go into making a very robust, very safe system to put into patients' homes. And as you, yeah, and I'll talk about it in a bit, maybe sort of like the capillary versus venous piece. Yeah, absolutely. There is differences. Actually, I'll talk about it now. There are sort of, yeah, there's always differences between capillary and venous sampling. It's something that I think has to be taken into consideration is that, sort of, yeah, you're comparing a large volume taken from like a central line into sort of, yeah, your body through sort of, yeah, to the excess capillaries, sort of the tips of your fingers and sort of, yeah, cutting them to sort of, yeah, get a small sample of blood out of it. And there are local variations and that has to be factored in. And it all comes down to the use cases and sort of, yeah, where we can actually add the most value. And in many cases, it's about being good enough to actually be able to triage a patient for further follow-up. I mean, that's really what this comes down to, is that we want the early warning systems. Like we aren't necessarily saying make a full diagnosis and completely shift the way that treatment's being delivered off the back of one of our results. But we're saying, look, here's a flag. This is a patient that needs your attention. Consider actually doing something about it. That's how we're beginning to approach it and how we're starting, because I think that gets people comfortable. It builds up experience and knowledge of using our system. And later down the line, I think, yeah, there are things that we are doing that should get us to a very high performance that can sort of add certain level of safety and security to, yeah, possibly replace some of those lab tests completely. So then going back to your other sort of question about sort of, yeah, how did we go about sort of even like sort of starting this and building this product? I think naivety was a wonderful thing back then. I think there was just, there was just that passion, that excitement of just like, here is a really big problem. There will be a way to actually solve this. Let's just go out and do it. Like sort of kind of forget what others are actually doing and how they're approaching it. Let's just don't take any of those preconceived notions over, oh, you have to take a lab analyzer and make it smaller and put it into a patient's home, because the technologies that have been tried time and time again of like sort of flow cytometry, so single cells being flown past lasers or capacitors, trying to miniaturize those for home use is just nigh on impossible. And interestingly, the technology Philips chose was actually a flow cytometer, and it was, it didn't work. So we just looked at sort of different technological approaches, and we settled on a very innovative, very different approach to anyone else. We centrifuge our samples. So every device that sits in the patient's home has a little mini centrifuge in it. We use density separation to isolate different types of cells. We have fluorescent stains. All of these are dried on to the consumables. So there's no liquids. There's no fuss at all. It really is a very simple interaction of just, fill this plastic container with a tiny drop of blood, drop it into the device, press go. But really it was sort of, about creating something that was very simple to use, but was from the ground up designed for the home. And again, we considered very closely, what was good enough. Like we weren't trying to be a lab analyzer. We weren't trying to be a 100,000 pound cutting edge SysMex machine that you find in the laboratory. We're trying to be a triaging tool. So what is clinically acceptable? What's actually safe and proportional to be able to give these results back to a clinician that they can do something off that will make sure that a serious deviation from what's expected is caught early and actually managed. So there was a huge amount of R&D that went into this. I think we had a team of nearly 60 people that were sort of just dedicated to working very closely with clinicians and patients through co-design. And at the same time, a very talented technical team that was actually building the electronics platform and sort of like the sensors needed to actually do this. But it was just a real trial and error. Let's just like slowly start assembling people that we think we needed. We made lots of mistakes. There was plenty of times that we probably didn't have the right people in place, and we learned the hard way through things just not working in trials and having to go back to the drawing board. But it was a really enjoyable journey, incredibly challenging. I mean, hardware's tough. I mean, we are sort of 8-9 years old as a company now, and it's not like software. You don't have these sort of that quick turnaround. So let's just use this sprint to put a new feature out, and then we'll just launch it. It really is bring all the hardware, the software together, validate it. Yeah.
It sounds like a heck of a feat of engineering to actually bring all that stuff together. And it's interesting what you say about naivety. I hear that so many times from my guests. Like, if I'd known how difficult it was going to be, I probably wouldn't have actually started. And I know that, the NVIDIA CEO said that recently, or founder said that recently as well, which I think has popularized it. But I think that naivety is a really interesting piece, especially where you start pulling on the thread, or you start trying to put that thing together, and it's just problem after problem after problem. It's engineering feat after engineering feat after engineering feat. And I guess I hadn't appreciated, because of course, when you're thinking about that sort of thing, you can go out and find these technologies and sort of patch it together. But it sounds like you did a much more sort of all-encompassing job than that, of like actual redesign and looking at specific sensors and that type of thing, and actually just building it really truly from the ground up. How do you then go about defensibility on something like that? I imagine it's got multiple patents involved in this now, so I imagine this is quite defensible. But how do you think about defensibility?
Exactly as you say. I mean, the benefit of being able to build something from the ground up and a totally new approach means that you have a lot of breadth to actually protect and sort of secure this space. So there are other ways to do blood counts. People will try and develop those, and maybe someone will eventually crack one of those approaches to do it at a point that you can put it into a patient's home to do these tests. But we've put, I think, 10 patent families around this. I think 70 patents in total that protect it. So some really unique IP. Wow. So it's a very special technology. I mean, at the same time, we're able to sort of, this comes onto a bit of the future vision for it, but I mean, blood counts is where we started, but the approach that we're using, I mean, is really suitable for biochemistry testing as well.
So this is why I was going to ask about this. It's fascinating when you've got that ground up build, you've got the defensibility. I think there's plenty of places it can go. Before I get excited and talk about that, where does this device fit into the clinical pathway? Who pays for it? And what does the clinical pathway look like? And I'm thinking patient, pricks their finger, gets the test, gets a result. Where does that result go? Does the patient own it? Do they have to present it to someone? Do they use it as like, I can go to A&E now because, or like, how does this fit in? What's the patient journey through this? And I guess the system journey.
So we built some phenomenal hardware, but then actually delivering that into patients' homes is a whole other piece of work. And again, looking to naivety, I think when we rolled this out, we were thinking it's going to be pretty straightforward. Like, how hard can it be after developing this? Surely it can't be that difficult to get this to patients'
It's useful.
homes.
It's great. Someone will buy it. Multiple people will buy it. It will be amazing. Welcome to healthcare.
And it was some. So we had the benefit of actually during COVID, we did like a sub product, so a precursor to this fully fledged full blood count analyzer, and we rolled it out actually to support patients with CKD. So a bit of a non-oncology distraction that we had for a while. But because of that deployment, it did give us a bit of a window into sort of what to expect and how important it was to actually take patients and healthcare professionals on this journey of using our service. And it really is a service. Like, yes, we have really unique hardware, but we don't sell devices. We don't sell tests. Like, this is an end-to-end solution of just getting the right data in front of healthcare professionals. So we've built it as like an end-to-end integration into sort of existing clinical practice. So basically, day one, patients decide, or clinician decides that a patient's going on to a particularly toxic therapy that's going to have side effects that are very relevant for us to monitor. They'll then decide, okay, well, look, we want to give you Liberty, which is the name of our service, to also have at home with you. They enter a few key details into one of our dashboards, which is clinician facing. That then triggers a release of our monitoring product to a patient's home. So they then receive that. We then train them virtually, make sure that they're fully set up, they're comfortable using their platform, and then they just get to sort of their normal testing cadence. Every device has a built-in 4G connectivity, Wi-Fi, so we get those results no matter what. So the second the test is done, there's no patient interaction. They could sort of literally drop the cuvette in, close the door, leave it, and then those results will end up on our cloud system and then visible again to healthcare professionals to actually act on. So we wanted to make sure that that was a seamless experience, both for healthcare professionals not having to take on any new burden of actually being able to offer this service, and equally for patients, this needs to be as seamless as, or to interfere as little as possible with their day-to-day life.
Interesting. Who pays for it?
So in terms of payment, it comes back to the use case, actually. So there's two key ways that we use this product. Like the first one, and it's perhaps the simplest, is before every treatment, there's we term it internally a pre-treatment assessment. And that's usually maybe a physical checkup or a remote checkup to make sure that everything's okay, symptoms all right, sort of, are you experiencing anything sort of abnormal? And then there'll be some blood tests and maybe a couple of vital tests, maybe like blood pressure, weight, perhaps. Again, very geared towards sort of specific regimens, like what the tests are. But there are select treatments where pretty much the key factor to enabling that treatment to go ahead will be a blood count. And so in those instances, you can literally just swap out that lab test for one of our home tests. So long as it's above a certain threshold, we can say, yep, green light, this patient is definitely okay. Like statistically, we can be 99.9% certain that they're fine. Keep taking your treatment if it's an oral therapy at home, or come into the hospital and we'll get your treatment given to you. It saves two-stop shops, which is very common in oncology, where a patient is forced to come in the day before, 2 days before treatment to get that checkup, to then come in again for the treatment to then be delivered. And this is just a seamless, no, it's a green light. You come in, you sit in your chair, you get your treatment, you're back out again. And that also sort of significantly reduces the interactions required with healthcare professionals as well. So time saving, capacity saving, and definitely better for the patient from an experience perspective. We've seen a lot of interest from pharma in that. So traditionally, they might offer patient support programs where a nurse may go to a patient's home to do this. And now there's a digital solution that is highly scalable, isn't constrained by human capacity, often much more cost effective, that can then be scaled and sort of rolled out at national levels. So yeah, working with pharma has proven to be, I think, a very interesting route for us to take. The second use case is around monitoring, and that is about more frequent testing to be able to actually intervene earlier and make sure that someone doesn't end up in a hospital bed. And the economics for that are easier to understand. Like if you prevent a case of febrile neutropenia, you're probably going to save somewhere in the region of like £4,000 to £8,000 plus 7 or 8 bed days. So you don't have to prevent many of those to have quite a strong proposition to deploy this with a certain number of patients. And worth flagging that in the US, that can go up to like $25,000 to $30,000 to treat a patient. So even stronger economic cases there. So in those instances, I think we're very much now going over the next 12, 18 months, building the evidence base that really shows the economic benefits to providers to actually be adopting that particular use case. And part of that as well is actually getting people back into the community sooner. So rather than admitting them to a bed, if they are healthy enough, even when something has gone wrong, can we give them appropriate monitoring tools to keep them out of hospital in the first place and prevent that sort of downstream need of a hospital bed being taken up? So it's there's sort of a mix of models. We do a bit of work directly with healthcare providers where they're paying for like the upside benefit of increasing capacity and saving some of those downstream costs, and also working with pharma to actually support.
It's it's actually relatively clean, the model, like, relatively speaking, like of a lot of people that try and commercialize and try and capture value in improving patient outcomes. It can actually be quite difficult to do that. Like, this thing just makes patients better. It's like, well, what else does it do to save me money? Like, it's just like, that's not enough. It's actually really not. It's actually really heartening to hear that you can be so focused on something that's just so clearly beneficial to patient outcomes, that also just has an incredibly clear business model. Like, it is very, very, very clear, this, which I think is, as I say, incredibly heartening. What I want to touch on now, what you just mentioned actually before about biochemistry and the potential of your company and your vision and what you actually want to achieve with everything now. So this a few times before, but I think when we went through COVID, one of the things that we learned was, you can just create an at-home test in 5 minutes for this brand new thing. Like, why aren't we testing everything at home? Like, surely I can have one of these for my chronic conditions and some of my acute conditions. And like, why can't it do everything? It sort of showed the art of the possible in some fantastic ways of just like, hey, you can do quite a lot with biochemistry in the home here. And we've literally just proved that you can go from 0 to 1 in an incredibly short space of time. I'm actually surprised that I haven't seen more of a bottom-up demand from patients, particularly with chronic conditions, off the back of that, to go like, what the heck else can I test at home that stops me having to make this move? Like, I think it's probably a case of people not really understanding what is possible, perhaps, or to even worry about that because they've got enough going on. But yeah, I did expect to see maybe a bit more of a bottom-up demand from that side of things. But this firmly sits within that realm, and actually, there might not be the absolute necessity like there was in COVID, but there is a lot of benefit to be gleaned from moving diagnostic testing closer and closer and closer to the community, and indeed into people's homes. So do you want to talk about that a little bit, like what the vision is? I think, from a practical perspective as well, we can talk about that if you want to, and how it can be adapted. But yeah, I'm interested in sort of the broader vision piece of like, how do you think healthcare changes with this? Because you'll have seen it in this niche of oncology and FBC. Like, you've seen it, you've seen the change that can happen. Like, I'm interested, how do you think healthcare changes when you do execute on this biochemistry vision?
So I spent a lot of time trying not to get distracted and get too excited about how big this could get, because like, I think I've been burnt.
I'm giving you permission,
times.
Toby. I'm giving you a bit of permission for the next 15 minutes. Indulge yourself in the big vision, and then completely forget about it and focus.
I mean, if we looked up 10 years out, I mean, there is absolutely no reason that, if you do have a serious chronic condition, an acute condition, like, why shouldn't you have monitoring equipment that covers both vital symptoms and also blood tests? Like, that should absolutely be feasible. The challenge is obviously sort of that it's really hard to make this type of technology. So it's going to take time to get out there. But that is the world that we're trying to build. I mean, we want people to have the convenience of not having to actually be highly medicalized, brought or dragged into hospital settings to do these routine checkups, or to make sure that something's not going to go wrong. For me, I think it is this move from this reactive approach that we have to a much more preventative one. And we've got to show it in a niche. And that's why we've chosen oncology, because there is huge value to be gained here for patients and for healthcare providers and payers. So let's prove it out here. Let's continue to double down on the blood testing component, because that is what we are really great at doing. Let's add in sort of additional features and additional sort of tests that sort of give us a more comprehensive or holistic picture of that patient's health. But the second piece of actually, I think, where we've got to go with this, and what I see, is actually leveraging the data that we are creating to actually support clinicians in their decision making. I think one of the power of having highly connected technology is that we are creating data sets that no one has ever seen before. And the quality of the data that we're getting, I mean, this wasn't even possible in clinical trials. And we've even had this told to us by some drug companies, for example, that there's sometimes a fear of finding out what's happening with their drugs, because we just shed so much light about sort of what's happening. But now my counter argument is that it's only going to be positive. You're only going to be able to sort of better titrate your drug, or only going to be able to keep patients on treatment longer as a result of it. But the ability to actually support clinicians in that decision making is, I think, a huge opportunity. And we dipped our toe into the more symptoms tracking, vitals monitoring ourselves. But I think what we're now doing is actually partnering far more readily with some of those companies that are establishing themselves within the oncology space to do this, and partnering up to share our data sets to actually then start creating these predictive models. And so we are developing sort of a lot of our own capabilities on that prediction front. But what we want to be able to do is to sort of, not require the clinician to build up this rich history of, knowing this trend means that this is going to happen to this patient and this particular drug. We can draw on thousands, tens of thousands of patients on a particular regimen across the world, see what's happened to them historically, what outcome actually occurred as a result of these trends that we saw from the blood results, and create new predictive markers that something may go wrong. what I want to be able to do is be able to say, not only just for sort of like the blood count related conditions like febrile neutropenia, that I want to be able to say, that look, in 5 days' time, there's an 80% chance of this person developing febrile neutropenia. We recommend initiating growth factors to actually prevent that. So that's one example, but yeah, you can multiply that across all the other damage that's done to different organs by different types of cancer treatments, whether that's acute kidney injury, whether it's hepatotoxicity. There are so many places we can go with this, but what we need is the data sets. So there are two arms to this business. Like, one is very much around, like, let's absolutely conquer the entire blood testing component and build these huge data sets. And the other is then let's leverage those data sets to then predict and support clinicians.
Yeah. What has the recent AI boom meant to you? Is this I don't know if maybe like large language models and patient facing versions of this is a theme. I don't know whether the boom is a distraction and actually this is something that you've just been fixed on for quite a while and this is irrelevant to you. It's just a bit of noise. Like, what does that AI boom mean to you?
So this is a bit like the questions that we gave ourselves on like a panel like over in Germany around sort of like the future of AI, because and sort of what it's already doing to the space. I think one of the things that's been really positive for us is that we have used different shapes and forms of like machine learning technology for years in the company. Yeah. I think the fact that there has been a boom in the use of AI, even just as a term, has kind of made it a bit more accessible, certainly to the investor community. They sort of like, they see there's something there. It's sort of, all of a sudden we're not having to talk about, I don't know, Bayesian decision-making approaches and stuff that like go over everyone's head. We can sort of simplify a little bit and people go, okay, that sounds interesting. Maybe we should find out a bit more about it. But I think the boom in large language models, I think it creates so much opportunity for like patient-facing engagement. At another conference recently, I think we had a stand next to a company that was basically creating sort of chatbots and like verbal-based chatbots. So they were just talking to patients. And I think that's a very interesting approach to make a more human engagement or human-based engagement to elicit what might be happening to a patient. Because you can ask predefined questions, score this from 1 to 5. But actually, what we often hear from clinicians is that a conversation can very quickly shed more light than a questionnaire about what's going on with a patient. So I wonder what that might do for sort of, patient interactions. I think and actually also taking the data that we produce to then provide recommendations. But I don't personally feel that's necessarily for us as a company to actually work on. For us, the innovations have actually come from slightly different places. I mean, sort of like behind the scenes, like Facebook has done some stuff on sort of like using longitudinal data sets and predicting future states. And so we've actually been drawing on some of the sort of like, I guess, the less prominent AI models to actually sort of think about how we could use them to actually help inform clinicians about where a patient may be in the coming days, so those interventions can be made. Yeah,
interesting. So one thing that comes up a lot in the AI conversation is trust, and actually, it's interesting that you don't necessarily. Well, you've talked about large language models in terms of patient facing, and they're not that might not be that useful for you internally. Building trust with clinicians, I'm interested for your product here, because clinicians are a really important audience for you, seemingly, because you're going to be giving them advice, you're going to be giving them decision support, and so they need to trust in the technology. They need to trust in you, in the company. They need to trust the result, frankly, and the accuracy of it. They need to. There's lots about the relationship with clinicians here, and in a way, like changing their jobs somewhat with the information that they're getting, or whatever it is. So, how do you think of that as a company with the work that you do with clinicians and building those relationships and building trust with them? Because they're an interesting group, and I say that as one previously. We don't like new things. We don't like things we don't understand. And when you're talking about Bayesian AI models and stuff, not that you need to use the word Bayesian perhaps anymore, but we're not great, I don't think, at embracing black box new things.
Yeah, and I think that's so I think there's two questions there. I think there's one which is about sort of like how do we generally just like build trust and belief from like the clinical community, and then related to the AI piece specifically, sort of how is that sort of being addressed? And I was speaking to a senior clinician, actually, one of the major European hospitals recently, and what he was highlighting is that AI has made some big inroads in the back office functions and streamlining properties, but they are really, really struggling on the clinical front, primarily because of that black box nature. That there's just no way to scrutinize it. Is that, you might be sort of more like you might perform at a higher sort of specificity sensitivity or whatever it may be, sort of compared to a human. But sort of when you do get it wrong, can we actually work out what's gone wrong? Can we actually scrutinize it? Can we check it? And I think sort of then it comes down to probably a very specific sort of use case by use case sort of discussion around like what risk are clinicians and sort of clinical communities willing to take on, are we willing to take the benefit, the upside of a better performance overall for the fact that we won't be able to necessarily find out why something didn't work in the other cases. But from our approach, I mean, generally for sort of that building engagement and sort of trust within the clinical community, I mean, it's from day one, like the first thing I did actually when we started the company was, in addition to working with Imperial, I shot off a ton of cold emails to clinicians around London to find other cancer centers to work with. So like, look, we've got this crazy idea. This is what we want to be working on. Do you want to be part of it? And actually people came back, and we had like some of the Royal Marsden sort of in those early days were sort of like super keen to support us. They were just like, come on in, let's sit down and chat. And we put some big grant applications in. And that's just led to this behavior where whenever we want to do something, the first thing we do is we pick up the phone to clinicians, to nurses, sometimes to patients as well. And we just talk about it, and we like bounce these ideas around, and we make them part of the entire journey. Like the Christie up in Manchester, I mean, Europe's largest single cancer centre, they have been a part of this journey from pretty much day one. I mean, straight after the Marsden, we got the Christie involved, and they have been on pretty much every grant application we've ever written. One of their team has always been part of our trials. And I think having that validity, the fact that they've been there to scrutinise all of these steps that we've taken, that sort of, ensuring that we're keeping ourselves very honest. And so that there's someone to really check, what is the performance? What does this mean clinically? How can we write new protocols? And we actually had one of their team recently with one of our pharma partners, and they were sort of presenting how they'd changed protocols to other hospitals. And so they were helping share what this means and sort of how it can actually become part of, I think, clinical practice. Which I think you were speaking to, as one of your podcasts a couple of weeks ago. Was it Dimitri Tran?
Oh, yeah.
I think you were chatting to.
Yeah. Well, that came to mind. Healthcare data is the new uranium. Yeah.
But he was like, I think, what was he mentioning? He was saying that, I think about sort of doctors only listening to doctors. And I think with this case in mind, I think having sort of, very well established, well respected institutions as a core part of the product development process, I think helps no end to then actually sort of share those best practices and their own views on this, rather than us just going in and trying to market ourselves to them as an unknown entity quite often.
Yeah, definitely. Guys, it's such an important point, and it's a nice approach. It's funny that you say if we have a new idea, we pick up the phone and just talk about it. That goes back to that artistic play version of how you see innovation, because you don't go, I developed a questionnaire and I found a sample and I rang them and I read the questionnaire out and I got some scoring, and now we can say that with X% confidence, 80% of people somewhat trust what we're about to do. Or like, do you know what I mean? Like, we just picked up the phone and talked about it. It sounds really similar actually to what Dom from Tortoise does and did, and talked about what he does. That he just went round the wards and asked people what they were worried about. It's a similar version where it's like, not only are you getting the information, in a qualitative fashion or however you want to describe it, but you're actually just building a human relationship by just talking, rather than running through a predetermined questionnaire to make sure that you're confident that someone is somewhat trustful or whatever it is, which I think is really nice. And I think that's something that I think we can learn from. I think a lot of people can learn from in health tech innovators. And it's not just about the data that you get from an exercise like that. It might well be the relationships that you build in the process. And I think that's definitely worth remembering. So whereabouts are you guys now? Where is the company now, the product now? You talked about pharma as a model. You talked about healthcare organizations as a model. Whereabouts are you in both of those fields, I guess? And where are you hoping to go in the next sort of year or two?
Mm-hmm. So honestly, I mean, it's still early days. It's like a regulatory approval is one thing, but actually sort of getting out into like the wider field is sort of another. So we are very much like sort of in the midst of real rollout and actually sort of getting a lot of centres onboarded. And that in itself is exciting, just seeing the appetite and the desire to get this to as many patients as possible. So we're sort of seeing a lot of growth within the UK, both within NHS through pharma, but also sort of doing a lot of work now with the private sector. And I think that's somewhere where quality of service is hugely important. Providing people with this new layer of sort of a safety net and the ability to better manage patients is absolutely sort of game changing for a lot of providers. So a lot going on the UK front. We've begun our engagement with the FDA, and sort of I think a lot of interest from their side to sort of support us in our process of getting approval there. So we've got some exciting new trials kicking off this year out in the US. I think making some very interesting inroads around sort of some of the US provider side, particularly value-based care. There's sort of there is so much. I mean, when you talk about those economic models and sort of you look at how much it's costing to sort of deal with these hospitalizations in the US, there is massive pull from the US side. So we're sort of positioning ourselves now, actually, I think, just to do a small top up to our Series A. So we closed the second part of a 16 million Series A last year. And I think out to raise later this year because we've seen an opportunity to get FDA clearance much quicker than we previously thought. So we want to get that under our belt. And then I think sort of we may well end up with a larger Series B raise to sort of actually then get us into the US in a major way and also then continue to double down on the development activities for additional testing.
Awesome. Anyone particularly that you're hiring at the minute that you want to mention?
Yeah, so data science is unsurprisingly sort of a hot topic at the moment, but interestingly, it's sort of it's a mix. So there's going to be some of the longitudinal sort of predictive analytics parts, but also we sort of give the flexibility of our teams to also work on the blood analysis side. So a lot of what we're doing at the moment is actually making huge enhancements to the way that our device counts blood cells, and there is some really interesting like sort of machine vision problems that we like to tackle. So there's sort of the opportunities for data scientists to be sort of turning their hand to a lot of very, very interesting things that probably wouldn't normally get sort of in a lot of other traditional tech companies. I think the other piece as well, I think, sort of quality roles as well. I think it's so they get under-recognized quite often within the medtech field. And I was actually chatting to one of our quality interns that we got over the summer over just like how not a single university, actually, no, I think there's one university in the country, in the UK, that offers a degree related to quality and regulatory. And yet the industry is in such demand often of people in this. And we just don't seem to train them up at all. And so it's like, it seems to only ever be acquired in the job rather than actually from sort of the degree level itself, to the point where they studied biomedical engineering and they have done nothing on quality standards. And maybe it doesn't sound sexy, but it really is so important. So we're actively trying to get a few more people around the team who, again, like sort of challenge the status quo of how regulatory is done a little bit as well, and sort of find what MVP truly means within sort of a regulatory perspective to get those products in.
That's awesome, man. Toby, listen, this has been an absolute pleasure. I've just spotted the time. Like, we've been talking for over an hour. It's gone incredibly quickly. I think, this honestly, the best ideas, right? Often the ones that you think, why hasn't this been done anyway? It's such a first principles thing to be like, why do we wait for people to deteriorate that we know are incredibly likely to deteriorate? Well, they will, with 100% certainty, deteriorate at some point. Why are we waiting for things to go wrong in the home that if we have the ability to pick up the things that are reversible? It seems bananas that we are waiting until it is too late to reverse the reversible. That is such a bizarre concept that as we sit here now with everything that we have, the models that we have, the crazy technology that we have in our personal lives, that we do something as simple as letting the reversible go unreversed, which costs everyone in their health, in the system's finance, more. It's just bizarre that we do that. I think your device sounds incredible. I mean, 70 patents going into it. like at least from the sounds of things for now, before the next update. Built from the ground up, purpose built, with a system around it, with a service around it. Again, a really important point. Healthcare is not a collection of products; it is a service, and you have the wisdom to put a service around what you do. You have the wisdom to build this around clinicians, and yeah, I don't want to let that whole play thing go either. Like, I love that. I love that you studied art. I love that you combine art and science to innovate. I think that's perfect. Honestly, I think it's such a wonderful framework for innovation. And the final stupid question I'll ask is, have you had any Theranos comparisons thrown at you of the old at-home blood test device?
Plenty. And I'm sure it's only going to get more, actually. I think so. The more ambitious that we get, I think the more we start realizing that actually it's sort of that crazy vision.
Is this a Theranos that actually works? Question mark. Yeah.
The stuff the difference is that we've been very selective over what tests we do, and we're very honest about where the limitations of it are. We are not a lab that happens at home. This is very much about sort of triaging patients in a very safe way. But yeah, I think that the core principles of actually like what we are trying to do here, this is about sort of democratizing testing in a very unique way that actually gets into people's homes, that is going to really change the face of clinical care. And yeah, I'm happy to answer the questions always about comparison because
same vision, very different execution. Toby, listen, absolute pleasure, mate. For those people that want to learn more or that want to get in touch with you to learn a bit more, what's the best way for them to do so?
Definitely just drop us an email at info@entia.co, and we will absolutely look at it and it'll get triaged to the right person to answer any questions, or LinkedIn.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, mate.